to week 7 of our quilt samplers sew along 2022. So it's been planned. Then I had to change my plans. Just start. So week 7, we decided that, again, maybe this is part of your midterm exams, because, you know, we are right in the center of our blocks. We did one last week with the little piecing, and now we're going to be doing this block, which is a 4-patch Sawtooth Stars. So I don't want to necessarily do all my quilting in teeny tiny intricate blocks, but I really feel that we should challenge ourselves in a while and make sure that have those blocks in our quilt that we can say, oh my God, look at my points. I actually did that. So we are going to make these blocks so they're a little bit smaller than what we did before. But that being said, they aren't that small. Can we see this? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there.
That is not what we're making today.
That is definitely not what we're making today. But sometimes you just have to challenge yourself. Anyway, so I just had to show you that. But that's not what we're doing. So we are going to be doing this block here, which is a patch, because there's just 4 blocks. But each of the patches are pieced, and they're going to be that Sawtooth Star. So nothing really new in the sewing per se than what we did before, just it's smaller. Couple things to remember when you're using smaller pieces. What we really want to do is make sure we have a really nice needle in our sewing machine. And I like using the 50 weight Orfil thread and a 70-10 needle. So it's a little bit thinner needle. It's going to give you a more precise line, and you're not going to get that thread build up as much when you use the Orfil threads as you would, say, a 40 weight of some other brand. Also, really, really important to change your stitch length. So I go down when I'm doing really small pieces. I have to make sure for sure that I go down from the 2.5 to at least a 2. If your sewing machine sews with a 1.8, that's would be my preferred. Again, that tiny, I sewed with a 1.5.
We have a hello from Sweden today.
Well, hello. Thanks for joining us. I don't know if you can see this little block here that I sewed it with a 2.5 stitch. Why we want to lengthen them is this. If for some reason we go and stretch, you can see how much will undo when you have a larger stitch length. So if that's half of your block, you know, that's half of your seam that would be undone. So the smaller our stitch, the less likely that's going to happen. Another thing, talking about value, and remember I said some things happen to change. When I did our actual original colors, I wanted to keep this soft, and I wanted it to have the 2 very close colored blocks. So in my picture, I used my regular polka dot background and the white. And this is what happened. I'm going to just move that out of the way. The block is great. Block is wonderful. But I've really kind of lost the work that I'm doing for my points. If I'm going to be doing all this work that people are going to go, oh my God, look at how small those pieces are. I want to make sure that they can actually see how small and how great those pieces are. So I changed my color. So I used my grunge white that I had in a couple of the other blocks, along with my cream. So at least now they're going to show up more. And then my other block is going to be in that color. I did make the 2 blocks just to speed the process up a little bit today, but I did want to talk to you about the value, because that was a example. I sorted out all my fabric. Again, this is only for 1 set. Normally I would have both sets here. So I have the colors that I need to do for my flying geese.
Quick question about fabric. Does our background fabric need to be consistent throughout the quilt?
Nope, not at all. I have 2 different, what I call background fabrics. Where's my actual blocks, Tiff? Can you go get my actual blocks?
Oh, your other blocks?
Yeah, the ones that I've already made. I've got this one. I have one background fabric. But I didn't do that at the end of the day. I wanted a little bit more variation. So this is what I said was my background fabric previously. And a lot of my blocks do have them. But then on some of them, I decided just to get a little bit more variation, I have this tone on tone grunge white. So I do have lots of them with the pink. I have a couple of them that don't have a background at all. And then this one, because this was beige, I put the white corners. It gives you a lot of interest in your quilt, keeps it scrappy if you have a couple different backgrounds. The only thing I recommend or suggest is make sure that the background in your blocks is really different from the backgrounds that we're going to be doing in the set-in alternate block.
And for the machines that only have the 2.0 or the 1.5, which are you using? Which stitch length?
I use the 2.0 because these blocks aren't super small. With this one, I definitely went down to a 1.5.
Throw these over here.
So I have everything all set out. And another way for me to speed things up a little bit is to do all the same blocks all at the same time. So that being said, I would take all my flying geese and I all at once because that's where my brain is. So if I have to think about this only once, that's what I'm going to do.
We also got a greetings from North Florida today.
Oh, hi. I bet your weather over there is a lot nicer than here. We've got these great big beautiful snowflakes coming down. If with your brain you like to work on one block at a time, just sort out your fabrics and do one block at a time. So all I'm doing now is, again, just to do the flying geese blocks. I have on the cutting instructions which pieces for what size, because there's a few different sizes that we had to cut for this quilt. We had to cut 2s, we had to cut 2.5. So we're doing for the flying geese, we're using the 4.5 inch blocks and the 2.5 inch blocks. So I know my solid white goes with my purple and my white background ones go with my cream. Here's another thing that I had a hard time doing when I first started out, especially when it was a book. We were always told never write in your books. You don't do things like that. But this is your book. So why don't we just take it and mark purple there? Or to match whatever your colors are. So the blue is now my cream. And it's going to help your brain work really well and keep track of what you're doing. We are allowed to write in books when they're our books. Don't do it in library books, though. They kind of frown on that. So we're ready to sew our flying geese. One thing with this method, I really don't want to do it the old school flying geese, where we're going to cut a rectangle that is 2 by 3.5 with little 2-inch corners, drawing my lines and cutting and folding. We can definitely do it that way. Oversized like this with our ruler is just going to make our life so much easier.
We are getting a few people having sound issues. Just make sure you're talking straight to the...
I will try to talk a little bit louder. Again, because we're having little pieces, the smaller the piece, I really like to be using an ender and a leader to hold my thread to help things float along. Okay, so I'm going to take 4 2.5-inch squares and my 4.5-inch square. Remember, when we're going to sew the flying geese, we want to smoosh that square in a good 1/16 of an inch. Whoops, I forgot the other one. And I'm just going to put a pin in that one so it doesn't fall off. And off I go. Again, sewing, drawing that line from the center mark and sewing a 1/4 inch or a scant 1/4 inch on either side of that drawn line. Now, instead of flipping it around and sewing the other side right now, what I'm going to do is grab my second unit. I'm going to let that keep my threads, and then I am going to sew my second unit. I have to tell everybody that I went back through again and was looking at all the blocks that everybody posted. I'm amazed at the color choices and how well you're doing. I think everybody gets an A+ for that block from last week. That center was a little tricky. I can't wait to see all the finished quilts. Just making sure that my block didn't get moved. Now I can cut this one off. This piece that's in my machine will hold my threads, and I will sew this other side. Oh, I'm sewing with a 1.5 today. Yep. I'm going to grab one. And I can grab my leader, put that back in there. So now I'm going to be ready to sew the other squares on. But let's trim these first. Oh, I forgot to tell you, there's Tiffany's colors for her block. Unfortunately, she's doing some renovations at her home, so she wasn't in here early enough to get her block done. So she has homework. Oh, there's my ruler. Okay, so now I'm just going to cut them apart on that center line, just like I did before. And we are now going to press our seams towards our little square. Same as before. Whoops. I want to make sure that this stays nice and straight. So I am going to set that seam. My iron's not very hot. I forgot to turn it on. I'm going to finger press this so I don't warp that bias. Remember, that edge that we just cut is now a bias edge. We don't want to warp that. I think I just have to give my iron just a little second to warm up. It's not working very well. I forgot to do that before we went live. Is there any questions?
That's okay. I'm told they're still drawing their lines.
Ah, perfect. Perfect.
A little bit of catch-up time for everyone.
That's right. I'm going to be ahead of the game a little bit because I did get the 2 stars done. I didn't think that you wanted to watch me do all 4 stars, but it's all good. It is all good. Here's one thing that I don't want to forget to tell you. This week to give you the alternate block. For the twin size quilt, we need to make 6 alternate blocks and then our half blocks that fit on the edges. So I'm trying to get the instructions done for that, because what you can do is, as we're going on and as you have time, you will have lots of time to make all of the blocks before the rest of our blocks done. So we still have, you know, what is that, 5 more blocks to do after this. But that'll give us some time just to do the alternate blocks if we have a few spare moments. There.
Having a problem with my cuts. I need to go back to the beginning for a refresher. Maybe next week we should touch back on the cutting.
Awesome. I will definitely do that. Remember, when you're cutting, what parts, just give me a hint, what parts are you having a problem with? Just a whole refresher. Remember, when you're cutting, to make sure that the line of your ruler is beside your, or is on top of your fabric, not beside it. And that definitely is going to give you a couple extra threads, so that it'll give you a little bit extra room in that, in the seam allowance. Also, make sure that when you're holding your rotary cutter, that it's straight up and down and not at an angle. Because if you have it at an angle, you can't control exactly where it is. 2 of the points that I have to think about sometimes when I'm cutting. Alrighty. Second square. We have these little, some people call them foxes. I like to call them a little heart. So we're going to put our square on the other side of our heart, making sure that the triangle, because we have 2 different colorways going here, make sure we have the color that matches the other little points. Don't want to get them mixed up.
Need a whole refresher.
Okay. We'll see how long it takes, and if we have enough time, I can do it today, or we will definitely do that next week. One. Again, leaving it in the machine to be able to hold my threads for me. One, two, three, 4. Or 8 if you're doing all of them at the same time. If your machine has a straight stitch needle plate, it's really great to put that on as well. Then your needle won't push the corners in there. So if you do have one, they're really great to use. One. Two. Or is that 3? That's 3. Another thing that I haven't told you, just to be aware of, when I'm butting my next piece into my needle, make sure that you lift your foot and slide it right up to the needle, and it'll catch a little bit better because it'll be right under the feed dogs. My machine, because I have it set in the needle down position, my foot automatically comes up that little bit, so I can just slide it right in there and butt it up against my needle, and it'll sew my next piece. I can just leave that there. And on to the cutting and trimming. Again. So now when we cut, I didn't sew this one. That was my first one. Make sure there's 2 lines going before you cut it in half. There, that looks better. So now when I cut this apart, I now have 4 geese, enough for 1 star. Again, I want to press my corners, press my seams towards my little square. So when I'm pressing towards the little square, that means I'm going to put that little square on the top. Set my seam, open and press. Cutting them apart, you will have 2 different blocks. Again, one seam goes across towards the left, one goes across towards the right, but it really doesn't matter because that's all in our seam allowance. One, 2. One, 2. And then we have all our geese. So you can see when you really do chain piece and sew them all at the same time, you do end up working a little bit faster. Not that it's a race. We don't ever want to race and hurry up that it's, we take our time and enjoy the process. And every step of it, I like to enjoy the process.
There was, she did say she was having trouble with squaring up too. So maybe if you want to go over that.
Perfect. All righty. Okay, so we have to square up our little geese. I'm going to use this one. It'll be easier for you to see probably on camera. Sure. Let me just move my chair. So what I want to do first, my first cut, I want to make sure that my point is towards me. I want to ensure that I'm going to have that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So according to our pattern, it says there the flying geese trim to 2 by 3.5. So I'm going to find my line that says 2 by 3.5. Right above that 2, there's our little intersecting diagonal lines. That point right there will be the nose of our goose. So I am going to adjust this. So our black diagonal lines match on our seam. I have just a little bit of fabric all the way around and on top. If you don't have enough fabric that you can trim, you don't need a lot. You just need to, sometimes I even have like basically nothing. It's because you didn't you didn't nudge that corner square in far enough. So if you typically run out of, there's not enough to trim, make sure that you nudge that small square in a little bit more. I know if you use the magic wand, I didn't go over that today, and you're sewing on the lines, then you can make sure that you're nudged in only the 1/16 of an inch, because I've trained my brain to sew with a scant quarter and I only draw a line in the center. I have to nudge mine in a little bit more than what it says on the pattern. Okay, so now that I have my seams ready, I am going to, again, hold my corner. I have a seam up here, so it's going to want to shift under there. So I want to make sure that I'm putting some pressure on that corner so it doesn't shift. Again, rotary cutter, they all have a little bit of rough part up at the top. Doesn't matter what size or shape that you have, what kind. I want to make sure that it butts nice and straight up to my ruler, that it's not in an angle. So butt it right up to my ruler, put a little bit of downward pressure, and off we go. If I cut here trying to go to do my top, I'm going to nick my corner. You're going to end up rounding off the corners of your rulers. So take your rotary cutter, put it against your ruler, and back it up. Or at least just roll it down and then cut. If you're cutting and you have little threads that are still attached on, probably chances are that it's time to change your rotary blade. We'd never change it enough. I find that after we do change it, we go, oh my, why did we wait so long? Okay, so this is our perfect corner. So the upper right-hand corner changes down into the lower left-hand corner, and we are going to use now the 2 by 3.5 inch registration lines on our ruler. They're lined up on the edge of our block, and there's a little X on the top that's going to go right into that little goose's nose, the point of our triangle. And that's going to ensure that we have that 1/4 inch seam allowance that, so we're not going to lose our seam allowance. I hardly have any fabric there to trim off, but I still trim the whole line. A lot of times all it's taking off is a thread, but it just gives you a nice cut, even if it's just a couple threads. Deb Tucker rulers all on the papers come with wonderful instructions for us the left-handed people. And so you don't have to figure out how that it's going to go on. You don't have to figure out how to cut with your left hand by just trying to figure out from a right-handed person. She has wonderful diagrams right there to give you if you're left-handed.
And this is the wing. You didn't mention the name.
Oh, I didn't. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because we've used it before. Again, the wing clipper ruler from Deb Tucker. It is my go-to favorite for cutting and sewing flying geese. There was a couple questions a couple weeks ago. Somebody asked, how often should I change my needle? I found out the exact from the Schmetz website. They recommend changing your needle every 8 hours of sewing. That's not 8 hours of the machine being on. That's literally sewing. So if you sew a lot, you're going to have to change your needle more than if you don't. Give you a little bit of a guideline. Okay, here we go. One more time. Diagonal lines on my seam. I have a little bit more fabric on this one. This corner must have been pushed in, smooshed in a little bit more. I'm supporting that corner, pressing down on it so it doesn't shift. Top, upper right is perfect. Down to the bottom left. Depending on my quilt, sometimes I do a whole lot of these, and then I just stand up and go to my ironing board and do all my trimming. Doesn't take too long, but I do like the process. I like the fact that I know when I go to sew these into my unit that they're all going to be absolutely perfect, that I'm not going to have any little wonky, not quite triangle units. Even when I'm sewing a half square triangle, there's sometimes when you press it and open it up and it really doesn't look square. But once we square them up, we look absolutely perfect. You know, this is a really good example because you can see I've got lots of fabric here, but hardly any at this end. So I was trying to sew these in the perfect method without trim up space, it would have been off. Did that just go on? Our fan just kicked on. Tiff's going to run over and turn it off just so you can hear me a little bit better.
I think that was just blowing off the last of it.
Yeah. I don't know if you can focus in here, depending on the internet. That corner's off just a smidge. I miscut a little bit on my first cut. Sometimes I get yakking, but I still have my 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to leave that. I'm not worried about that. And nobody will ever notice that at the end of the day. This one's harder to see. My diagonals on my seam. Trim, trim. Because these were smaller blocks today, it looks like when I pressed them, I did a little bit better job than the other time. Remember, we had to go back and adjust a few of them because when I placed my diagonal lines on it, that one, they didn't quite line up. But I think because these are a little smaller, it didn't have a chance as much to warp that bias. They look pretty good today.
We've also done just about a bazillion flying geese lately, so
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe you just got better.
No, just lucky today. But again, we all do it. Like, don't feel upset that you have to unsew something or that your seam's off and you have to go back and fix it. It happens to everybody. If you sew, there's going to be time. It would be really hard to unsew these because we're not cutting. I'm sorry. Yeah, when we cut them apart, they don't necessarily have that perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance because we've already sewn them, so it really didn't matter. So they're hard to adjust if we had to unsew and sew it back on. But I have known to do that once or twice. And there we have it. Enough flying geese for 2 sets of stars. I only have this little bit of wasted fabric, but I think that's not enough to waste to feel like I'm wasting fabric. That's just making or ensuring that I have perfect geese. I'm good with that. So now what we're going to do is take our 3.5 inch block for the center of our square. It'll probably see better here, right, Tiff? On the white.
I mean, with the purple background, either way.
Okay. We are going to take our purple flying geese. We want to match our center square. So we will have an actual solid star of one color. And then I'm going to match this background color for my points. And I just have to make sure that this fabric is on the right side. There is a difference, but not very much. Now, 2 ways to do this. I do both ways depending on the mood that I'm in the day. You could literally take your flying geese and you could line them up one after the other and stack them all up and just sew the whole stack of units. Today, I feel like just sewing a star. Thank you, Tiff. Don't sew that in there. So let's start. So again, I'm always going to take my piece on the right, flip it over to the left. This time, though, I really don't want to start sewing here because there's a heavy seam. And again, the smaller the pieces, the more chance they are that they're going to shift for me. So I want to start sewing on this end. Any questions?
No, just one person said I had to rip out and resew the checkerboard center 3 times to get it right.
Oh, three's the charm.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, sometimes we do have to do that. But I bet you feel more confident with your quarter inch stitch now, or your quarter inch seam. Now my next one, and on this block, I don't want to sew here. I want to flip it over so I can see my seams where they intersect, because my next seam that I come down, I want to make sure that it's just to say on the right of that intersection. So it will be right there. So in this case, I'm not pinning because they're small blocks, but I want to really make sure that, yes, I don't pin, but I do finger pin. I hold my fabric. I never let my fabric slide through my fingers, and I always guide it with my left hand as much as I can past my foot. So as I'm coming up on the seam, I want to make sure that that seam allowance doesn't. Are you able to see?
Move your hand. There you go.
Okay, so I want to make sure that this seam allowance doesn't flick in the wrong direction. So sometimes I have to stop and lift my foot and tuck it in because it'll get stuck on the edge of my foot. So then I can also take my purple thing. I'll help guide it. I want to make sure now I have quite a bulk here. It's going to literally want to push sideways. It doesn't want to sew on that. So I'm going to hold it with my left finger so it's right up against the foot. I don't want it to shift. I can slow down my stitching, and I can see that I hit that point. I wonder if it'll show better with the plastic foot. Again, the corner's going to want to slide sideways. So I'm sure that I'm going to hold it exactly where it's supposed to be. Have control. I'm just going to cut my thread. I'm going to put on the quarter inch, my other quarter inch that's a plastic, and see if you can see that any better. And it's not here.
Yeah, it is. Oh, it disappeared.
It did disappear.
I was using it last week.
You had the plastic one? What did you do with it? Tiff had my foot. These darn kids.
No, it was right there, but it's not now.
Okay, so I'm not putting on the quarter inch foot clear that we can see a little bit better
Because it disappeared.
Did you have it in the performance?
No, you have it on the 610.
Aha! That's where it is. Okay. Thank you, Tiffany.
I just thought of who was using the quarter inch foot last.
Alrighty. So we're going to sew this one here. I do like this. This is an added quarter inch foot that you can purchase for the FAF machines. It has a few more different markings on it. And it also has a quarter inch foot on both sides. Alrighty. Now that I've totally made a mess of things.
Is there a quarter inch at the star points, the place where you will join to the next unit? Yes, there is.
There definitely will be, yes. Once, when you, before they're sewn in, you can see that the star point doesn't have a seam allowance there because the point goes right to the corner. Once you sew it to your very next block, and once we press the seam, we now magically have the star point that doesn't go to the edge, we have our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Yay! If you don't, if you know that you trimmed it absolutely perfect. Actually, I did that on the weekend on one of the blocks that I was doing. When I went to sew it to the other one, I noticed that I was going to cut my whole corner off, turned it over and looked. My seam allowance had shifted, and I had too small of a seam allowance, so my point went too high up. So all I had to do is just re-sew this seam to make sure that my point didn't shift, and we were good to go. Let's just, now that I have a whole mess, let's just sort this back out. This one's in the frame, or I mean, sorry, this one's still in the machine. So I can now sew my top row. Again, I'm just going to flip it over so I'm not trying to get that seam allowance corner in the machine because it doesn't like the bulk. I'm going to stop right there, lift my foot, and make sure that this seam allowance is in there. My next unit, again, my flying goose is on top. I'm just eyeballing where my needle is because I want to make sure that it hits my corner. I'm trying to sew so you can see if my fabric, did you notice it starting to pucker? So I just stopped sewing, lifted my foot, and it went back to where it was supposed to be. My corner is misaligned. Just going to line that back up again. Let's go back to our last row for our last little corner that we have to sew on. Again, foot's up. I'm butting it right up to my needle.
I have to pause. I need to change my cutter blade.
Atta girl. Yeah, there is sometimes, especially when we're trimming up little things again, we want to make sure that we have a new needle, a new cutter. Home. I put a brand new cutter in the cutter the one time because I had one. It worked just fine, and then I hit a pin. So now I had a nick in it, but I had a deadline of stuff I had to do. So I had to struggle with it all weekend. So what ends up happening now is I always have a spare blade on hand. Alrighty, again, so here is our block. We have our center with our flying geese, and we have the two little flying geese on the ends. My block is automatically going to want to press our seams towards our solid squares. So let's just do it that way. Set my seam. I want to make sure if I pull it open like this that it's straight. Easy to pull it at an angle. I want to make sure that I'm visually lining up my sides to make sure they stay nice and straight. Whoops. So my unit is staying nice and straight.
You didn't press these so they would butt together.
No. Again, making sure that it comes straight up because it's going to want to go crooked. Now I'm not tugging. When I'm pulling on the end, I'm not really pulling. I don't want to see my stitches. I'm keeping it aligned so it's nice and straight. Now this one, I want to press my seams towards the solid square. So my solid square is on top. This one just takes a little bit more Pressing it open with our fingers. Pressing it open with our fingers. Here's the comment that Tiff had made when we sew our blocks together. Because pressing them all in the same direction, our seams are going to have quite a bit of bulk in this area. So we could press one of them out. So say we could press the one color out and the other color in, and then these seams will match up a little bit better. So let's do that. This one's not pressed anyways. Excuse me. Do we have to do them all? Do we have to do them all? Yes, we really should have. This one's going to be a little bit more challenging, but I'm going to press this seam out. Because I've already pressed, I'm just going to touch it on the back here to try to get them in the direction that I want. I'm going to have quite a bit of bulk on this little point, but it's good. So our purple one, we're going to press out in the other direction from what we said before, just so they butt together with the block that we already had. See, that's one of the things about a sew along. If this was an actual pattern that I was doing and writing it as we were going, I would have already found that out. And you wouldn't have seen the difference. It would have already been written on the pattern.
So Cindy's purple one, that is the peach on the pattern, is going to be pressed out.
Yes. So I'm pressing this out. And then I'm going to fix these ones. And I'm going to press these in. Here's where it doesn't want to press because of that seam allowance. So I really have to help it along with my fingers. I'm going to... If I'm pressing these ones out, these ones have to press in. Again, because I'm changing the direction of the seam that I've already pressed, I want to press it down. That corner is going to be cranky. So now when I press this together, because I pressed them in the opposite direction, they're still going to butt here. Again, this is a seam that I want to match. So I am going to pin here. Like you've seen previously, I don't pin everything, but when I'm matching a seam, I really pin that. And this is where I really love my either the clover silk pins or the bowhin ultrafine pins. They're very sharp, so they don't distort my fabric. And they're very thin, and they're very sharp too. Again, so now I do have a seam allowance on this corner. So we're just going to have to take a little more care going through the sewing machine. Thank you, Tiff. So again, we have the clover silk pins. Those were my all-time favorite. Bowhin has a beautiful pin. Again, you can see they're very short. There is the clover pin. The bowhin pins, I think they're orange and blue.
Let me stop moving.
But you do want a fine pin. They also now have These pins, they're magic pins, so they have a much heavier grip on it. So arthritic fingers and stuff can grab them a little bit easier. But again, they still are fine. A lot of us have these flower pins or the yellow-headed pins. They have a purpose in our world, but just not for sewing our matching seams together. They're very thick and they will distort your seam allowance, in my opinion, anyways. But if you start using a very fine pin to do that, you'll notice that they go together much nicer. Alrighty. Making sure my, where's my purple thing? There it is. I want my seam allowance to still stay where it's supposed to be. I hit my point of my intersecting seams. If you're one to sew over the pins, you can. I prefer not to. So what I do is I pull this pin that's almost out, but it's not out. It's still holding in my fabric. I will sew right up to it, and then I will pin it or pull it out of the way. I want to make sure that those seams stay nested together nicely until I actually sew it. And so we have decided that our purple is pressing out. So we are going to press this out. It's a little bulkier at that corner, but it's still really doable. Other side. Make sure I get it in the right direction. Butting my seam. Sewing slowly. Because my fabric wants to push, because I have that extra seam allowance, I will take a little stitch or two, lift my foot so my fabric goes back to where it's supposed to be until it gets past that seam. If you don't have a purple thing, this is where a lot of times, if I can't find it, sometimes it disappears. This is where I like the flower-headed pins. They're quite firm, so I can use that like a stiletto as well, holding that fabric in place so I can hit those points that I want to point. Again, I have to press the seam, so I want to set it. So I'm going to make sure that because of those points down here want to be a little unruly, I'll repress them again. I'm lifting with my fingers, making sure that my seam isn't flipped in the wrong direction. And we're good to go. At this point, if you want, you can give it just a teeny tiny bit of steam and get it to lie exactly. So that's 3 stars. I have one more star. I can answer some questions while I sew, but I'm just going to zoom along this. But I am going to align them up perfectly again. Tiffany, I lost my, oh, there they are. Never mind. I got them. My corners. I do want to align them all up again so I know exactly that I have all my pieces and where they're going. So let's just go along. I don't know if you can hear me very well while I'm sewing, but like I had said, I'm hoping to have all the instructions for your alternate block for next week. So we'll have a few to sew along to get those done while we're doing our other blocks. So if you don't have your fabric yet chosen for that alternate block, might be a time to go to the Quilt store. It's always a good day when we get to buy a new fabric. You do have your blocks now that you have enough variation that you can see exactly what your fabrics will look like for your alternate block. You can throw some of your blocks on top of it and make sure that you can see the difference. Today, I will do what I've decided to use for my alternate block. I want to really do this chain block, so that's the one I'm going to be concentrating in. If you could comment in the comments below whether you're doing the alternate block or you were thinking that you wanted to do the hourglass block that I had showed at the beginning. So I will definitely demo that as well for you. But if everybody is doing the chain block, then we'll just concentrate on that next week.
I think there was a few that wanted the hourglass.
The hourglass block? Okay. Just hit these ones with our steam. So now this one, we want to press opposite the other one. So I am going to press towards our solid squares this time. 1, 2. And now I can align this one. I'm going to press the other one in a moment. I'm just leaving it in the machine to hold my threads.
Yes, at the end of the stream, we will definitely show the pictures again of the hourglass blocks and chain blocks. Oh, Brent says he's doing the hourglass.
Brent?
Martine.
Oh, Martine's doing the hourglass? Awesome. Okay, so we'll definitely go over that then as well. So next week will be a busy week. And there's my meter. There has been a few people, you know how I keep using just this little piece of fabric as a leader, and it just keeps going over and over and over again. I know my sister's one of them, and I believe Linda Carey has done it as well. She will have a whole little section of, say, 2.5-inch squares sitting beside her sewing machine. So every time she needs a starter, a leader, or an ender, she uses one of the little piles. So by the time she has a full quilt finished, she also has a pile of, say, 2 blocks or 4 patches that are sewn together for something else. You just have to think about that one and be a little organized, that's all. Rolling that seam, butting that one in. There we go. My seam allowance got stuck on the edge of my machine. It was exact same width as what my machine was. And you noticed it's okay to slow down your stitching. When I'm getting to a critical point where I want my seam to be perfect or it's going to go wonky, I slow my stitching down. I make sure that that works. And then in the straightaway, I can speed back up again. And this one doesn't want to go in the right direction. There we go. I can just give that a little squirt of steam. I'm good to go. And just aligning these up that we have our 4 patch. Now I have a lot of seams that we're going to match. We want to sew from here and hit that seam. So in a perfect world, those will exactly be a 1/4 inch. We can also pin match those if we want to be exactly ensuring that that we're going to hit that spot. This is again some place where I like to use those really heavy pins. In this spot here, because my seam's pressed over, I cannot see that where the seams intersect to find my 1/4 inch. But I can put my pin in here. So it is, okay, that pin is bent on the end. It had a little hook on it. So I want to make sure that my seam comes out right at the point of that little wing of my flying goose, of my triangle. And it is going to go into the point of this one. I am going to hold these. You can see my seams are now butting together. And it's going to align, hopefully, perfect. Oh, I wasn't supposed to pull my pin out. Again, if I want to, on this side, I can see that point. I can also peek here to make sure that it's at that point. We can do it that way as well. Jiggle that so it's aligned up. We're good to go. Let's see this one. Here's our test. Now there's going to be a lot of bulk in this seam. So we're going to have to take some time and sew. I'm going to make sure that that bottom seam is going in the direction that I want it to go. I don't really want to pull this pin out until I absolutely have to. Nice and slow. Because I'm manipulating it, I want to make sure that this stayed lined up with my block on the bottom. It's always easy to double check to make sure our edges are aligned up properly, then to unsew. This one's going down, that one's going up. I don't have any aligned seams that I can see. So we're just going to have to hope for the best. I've aligned up my edge. I'm going to grab my pin. Can I look first? We'll see how well they're lined up.
Zooming in.
Oh, thanks a lot, Tiff. Oh, not too bad. Not too bad at all. I've got a little bit of excess background here. You can see that my point is not in the seam. My point is not at the seam. I'm just going to peek on this side. It looks like it shifted a little bit. That it shifted a little bit. I'm just going to take a little bit bigger seam because they were both off a little bit. I'm just going to fudge this in. That amount that it's out though, if it doesn't bother you, just leave it. Take another peek. There, that's a little bit better. And I'm going to sew this one together here as well. Again, let's pin match those points. I can see my seam on this one this time. So my pin goes right in at that corner. Pin goes right in at this corner. What did I do? That one's sewing out. I'm going to just turn it this way. It's going in. Yes, that's exactly what I wanted.
So look, 4 stars done, and I have my first set of flying geese trimmed. I'm slow, but they're perfect, if that's any consolation.
That is the most important thing, that your geese are perfect. That's fine. Remember, though, I've been sewing since this morning that I had those 2 stars done already before we were even on screen. I had all my cutting done. I had all the 2 stars sewn. So you're doing good, Bev.
Cindy cheated today and sewed ahead.
I did. I knew I wanted to go over a little bit for the alternate squares, so. Perfect. I'm okay with that. Let's get these lined up. Oops. I wanted it that way. Not that it matters. Just so it matches. I'm trying to match my pictures to my blocks to the picture as close as we can, subject to change. Excuse me. Just so it's a little bit easier for you to follow along. But if yours goes in the other direction, there was no way I would ever unsew it just to say that because your light dark isn't the same as my dark light.
Cindy, you turn it a quarter turn clockwise.
Well, you could, I guess. But just for this block. We've got lots of seams to match on this one. Again, depending on what you feel you want to do, you could either press the seam open or press it to one side. I didn't iron right now. I just made sure that they were going in opposing directions. When I pressed my first block, the one that I had sewn already, I didn't press the seams to go in the opposite direction like we had decided on the 2 blocks that I did today. So my seams are going in the same direction. Oh no, not this one. If they are, it's really not that bad of an issue. So if they are going in the same direction, press one to one side with your fingers, jiggle and align your seam perfectly, pinch it really well so it doesn't move, and put your seam back to where it wants to be. And you're going to have that extra bulk there that you'll have to slow down so that your machine can go over it. Oh, I forgot this. There, this one.
But it'll still.
But it'll still work. So I'm living dangerously with this one, and I'm not pin matching my star points. And it all depends on how well I trim my flying geese. But we're going to see whether I will be sorry I did this or whether I will be happy. This is one of the seams that are going in the same direction as the one on the bottom one. So I have to be really slow and careful because it's definitely going to want to shift sideways. Tiff, if you have a minute on the clipboard, can you find the picture of the quilt that has the hourglass? Thank you. Well, just going to grab my bottom block here, and I'm just going to adjust that edge of my block to make sure that they were lined up. Oh, we can show that one too. I'm not going to demo that one, but we could definitely show that. Alrighty, folks. Our moment of truth. Where are you focused on?
Right about there.
Right about there. Oh, they're matched up fine. This one's off a little bit if that really bothers me, or Tiff might take it and make me undo that one after. But I've lost this corner a little bit. So I might unpick that one. But the rest look pretty good. Ah, I can see what happened. My seam allowance folded over. So I am definitely going to fix that. And that's probably why my seam shifted. Now, because that was the only point that I'm worrying about, I'm not unsewing the whole block. I am just unsewing this point. Anybody that has taken a class with me will laugh because you probably can't see my head, but I have to look over top of my glasses. I say I'm always like Superman. I have to use my supervision. Take those glasses off. Okay, so I've got my point unsewn. It's sewn here and it's sewn there because everything was matching up. It was just this seam. I am going to see if I can match that up just a little bit better. Okay, here's something to talk about seams. Let me just sew this. So now I've got them going in the right direction. And it's matching up a little better. Here's something to talk about whether to unsew or not. It depends on the project that I'm doing. If this was just a quilt that I was doing at home, something that I was learning, that other point that was there, I wouldn't have actually unpicked that other than it was folded over. Depending on whether I want to custom quilt it or not, it makes a difference which way this. But because I'm the teacher and people are poking, looking really closely to see whether it's good or not, if I was going to take this quilt and put it in a show, then I want everything to be spot on. I'm going to take those points apart that don't quite line up. But if this was just a quilt that was going to my grandkids to drag around, to line, or it's just for me, I wouldn't necessarily have picked that corner out. Give yourself strive for perfection, but give yourself some leeway. And just remember that, yep, this is where I am in this stage of my quilting. And I'm okay with that. And I can live with that. If it's going to drive you nuts every time you see it, then pick.
You had a question.
Sideways, no. I'm just going to double check here to make sure that they're going in the right direction. That one's going in the wrong direction. That one goes in this direction. And now that my block is finished, I just want to give it a little bit of steam, just so everything lies nice and flat. I can feel my seam allowance was going in the wrong direction on that one. And there we have it. Our 4-patch Sawtooth Star. Again, like I said, ladies, this is definitely going to be one of the more difficult ones. Next week is going to be easy. And then from now on, I don't think there's anything as small as what these are. We're going to be missing. We're going to be tools, but and a couple new techniques, and all is good. So these last weeks with that little 16 patch in the center, and this one with all those little, those are our hardest blocks.
Ellie said, is your white in both blocks the same material? Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I just the consistency. So my background was the exact same. So I only have the 2 fabrics that I'm using. That being said, if it was your block and you were doing this really scrappy, you could make them all different. But I wanted the consistency to stay the same.
And do you guys want to see my block this week?
She got her cutting done. Okay, let's talk about some setting alternate squares. So this is the one that I am going to concentrate on a little bit more. I like this block because what ends up happening with this block? That is the block right there. So it's a simple 9-patch that has 4 patch blocks in the corners. But what ends up happening is when we put it on our quilt, our eye visually sees this chain that goes through our quilt, and it almost looks like it has put our block on. Well, it has, but it just really changes the look of the quilt. I think it's pretty cool. And there's what it would look like in the queen size or the double size, 96 by 96. So that is the one that I've decided that I want to do for my quilt. The other option that we had thought that you might want to do is just a simple hourglass block. So the block is right here. We did do an hourglass block, I believe, was it week 2? The Ohio Star.
I think that was week 2.
I think that was week 2.
No, 3, I think.
Week 3. So that was a simple block to do, especially if we have that Tucker trimmer, because we want to make sure that that point stays in the same. But what happens when we set our blocks with this, it almost ends up looking like I put white corners on some of the blocks and I put the blue corners on the other blocks. So again, it's a little simpler than the chain, it's just a little less piecing than the chain block, but still pretty cool to do. If you don't like either of those blocks, those settings, you could also sash your quilt. If you didn't want to just do plain sashing, sashing is just putting strips of fabric in between our blocks. And we have cornerstones in a color, but on our sashing strips, we put little folded corners. So we end up having these squares in these little stars in the corner of our blocks. So that's pretty cute too. I really like doing this on a little girl's quilt. I don't know if we'll have time to do this one as well, but we will definitely be showing you some really cool ideas on how to do folded corners. But just let me know in the comments if there's something that which one that you would like to do. Alrighty, so our sashing colors. Here's where we want to do. So I sashing to be two colors, a light and a dark. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that my light is different than what my blocks are. I want to make sure that my blocks are going to pop off of this background color. So it doesn't matter which one I use or which block that I have. It's really going to show nicely on this cream. Now, because for my dark, there is a couple different darks in the line. So I have decided to do, I couldn't decide which fabric to use. So I loved this fabric because it had the paisley, but I thought maybe big for the little floor patches. So because they both have the same background color, I'm going to use the paisley for the larger block, the center of my 9 patch, and my little 4 patches, I'm going to use this fabric. So instead of having just the one fabric, I'm going to end up using the 2 because I can. And it'll just add a little bit of difference. Tiff, what are you doing?
So I have set mine up on the wall here for you to see. So I'm also using 2 colors for the sashing, a dark blue with a star and a dark blue with a polka dot. And then I'm actually using a darker color than what's in most of my blocks. Instead of going very light in the sashing, I wanted more of a brown kind of tone.
Tiff's quilt's going to be living on her couch with her animals. So she thought a light would be a little bit too much light for her house. And then she has a wonderful chocolate brown couch too that it'll show up really nicely. So that gives you a little idea of the alternate blocks. Oh,
too far.
Too far. Little idea for the alternate blocks for next week. So I have my homework done. I have to make sure that I get the proper sizing for not that block so much because that block's easy. It's going to be these corner blocks. I cannot just take a regular alternate block and cut it in half and put it on the side because there will not be any seam allowance on this outside edge.
So that's going to be 2 separate.
Have to calculate that. Maybe next week we might just be doing the full blocks and we'll talk about the alternate block in a previous week. If I've got all my homework done, I'll be able to cover them both tomorrow. Or I'm sorry, next Monday. Next Monday. Alrighty, so you can join us again at 4 o'clock. We're going to be live again for a few minutes that we have forgotten draw for So we're just going to come back live at that time and do our draw on Facebook. So if you don't know what it is, just if you're shopping in the store and if you bring in a homemade reusable bag, so we can reduce plastics, but because we're a quilt store, it has to be homemade. Get your name in a little monthly draw for some cute little something or other. So if there's no other questions, I'm going to say goodbye. So you have your homework to do. I have my homework to do. So happy sewing, and we'll see you next Monday. Bye now. And the last thing that's